In the 1950s and 1960s, grandmothers made Betty Crocker cakes that mattered. They weren't bakery bought, but when you grew up, that smell, taste suddenly vanished from the table. These 60 forgotten cakes might sound too plain today, but they fed families under $2. Let's rediscover what grandmothers baked when budgets were tight. Yellow layer cake with chocolate frosting was the backbone of every 1950s celebration: birthdays, church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners. The cake was made with butter, sugar, eggs, flour, milk, and vanilla extract, mixed by hand or with a stand mixer, then baked in 2 round pans until golden and springy. The chocolate frosting was simple: butter, cocoa powder, powdered sugar, and milk, beaten until smooth and spreadable. The layers were stacked, frosted, and served on a cake plate. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Butter was 50 cents, sugar was 20 cents, eggs were 50 cents, and cocoa powder was 30 cents. The cake was soft, buttery, moist, and rich, with a tender crumb and a deep chocolate frosting that wasn't too sweet. It was the default birthday cake, the potluck cake, the celebration cake that everyone recognized and no one complained about. Yellow layer cake was everywhere, but when something simpler was needed, Devil's Food Cake arrived darker and richer. Devil's Food Cake was the chocolate lover's answer to yellow cake, made with cocoa powder, hot coffee to deepen the chocolate flavor, butter, sugar, eggs, and buttermilk. The batter was dark, almost black, and the cake baked up dense, moist, and intensely chocolatey. The fudge icing was thick and glossy, made by boiling butter, cocoa, milk, and sugar until it reached the right consistency, then beating in powdered sugar until smooth. The cake cost around $2 to make in the 1950s. Cocoa powder was 30 cents, buttermilk was 25 cents, and coffee was free from the morning pot. Devil's Food Cake was served at birthdays, anniversaries, and any occasion that called for serious chocolate. The cake was rich, dense, and fudgy, with a frosting that hardened slightly on the outside but stayed soft underneath. If Devil's Food was too dark, the next cake went the opposite direction: pure white. White cake with 7-minute frosting was the elegant choice for weddings, showers, and formal celebrations in the 1950s and 1960s. The cake was made with egg whites, not whole eggs, butter, sugar, flour, milk, and vanilla extract, and it baked up pure white, light, and tender. The 7-minute frosting was made by beating egg whites, sugar, and corn syrup over a double boiler for exactly 7 minutes until thick, glossy, and cloud-like. The cake cost under $2 to make. Eggs were 50 cents, butter was 50 cents, and sugar was 20 cents. White cake was softer and more delicate than yellow cake, with a fine, tender crumb that melted on the tongue. The 7-minute frosting was sweet, marshmallow-like, and impossibly light. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email, too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Spice cake with caramel frosting was a fall and winter favorite throughout the 1950s and 1960s, made with cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice, mixed into a butter cake batter. The cake was moist, dense, and warmly spiced, with a golden brown color and a fragrance that filled the kitchen. The caramel frosting was made by browning butter and sugar together, then beating in powdered sugar and cream until smooth and spreadable. The cake cost under $2 to make. Spices were pantry staples, and the rest of the ingredients were basic baking supplies. Spice cake was served in the fall and winter, especially around Thanksgiving and Christmas, and it was often baked in a sheet pan or bunt pan. Pound cake was the simplest, most reliable cake a 1950s housewife could make, originally called pound cake because the recipe used a pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. By the 1950s, the recipe had been scaled down, but the principle remained. Equal parts fat, sugar, eggs, and flour, mixed until smooth, then baked in a loaf pan until golden and firm. The cake was dense, buttery, rich, and plain. No frosting, no filling, just cake. Pound cake cost under $2 to make and required no special ingredients or techniques. It was served plain, toasted, with butter, with whipped cream and berries, or with a simple glaze. The cake kept for days, and it was perfect for gifting, breakfast, dessert, or afternoon tea. Pound cake was the backbone of home baking. Pound cake was dependable, but angel food cake was the opposite, light as air. The first 5 cakes were 1950s staples: yellow layer cake, devil's food, white cake with 7-minute frosting, spice cake with caramel, and pound cake baked in a loaf. But the next 5 go lighter and sweeter: angel food, chocolate sheet cake, pineapple upside down, marble cake, and coconut layer cake with cream filling. Angel food cake was the lightest, airiest cake a 1950s housewife could make, made entirely from egg whites, sugar, flour, and cream of tartar. No butter, no oil, no egg yolks. The batter was beaten until stiff and glossy, poured into a tube pan, and baked until golden and springy. The cake was turned upside down to cool so it wouldn't collapse, then removed from the pan and served plain or with whipped cream and fresh berries. Chocolate sheet cake with buttercream was the 1950s and 1960s party cake, baked in a rectangular sheet pan and frosted while still warm so the buttercream melted slightly into the cake. The batter was simple: flour, sugar, cocoa powder, eggs, buttermilk, and oil mixed together and baked until springy. The buttercream was beaten from butter, powdered sugar, cocoa powder, and milk until smooth and spreadable, then slathered over the warm cake. The cake cost under $2 to make and could feed 30 people when cut into squares. It was the birthday cake, the church supper cake, the potluck cake that disappeared in minutes. The cake was moist, rich, and intensely chocolatey, with a soft crumb and a buttercream that stayed creamy and smooth. Pineapple upside-down cake was the most dramatic cake a 1950s housewife could make. Butter and brown sugar melted in a cast-iron skillet, topped with pineapple rings and maraschino cherries, then covered with yellow cake batter and baked until golden. The cake was flipped upside down onto a plate while still warm, revealing a glossy, caramelized pineapple topping. The cake cost under $2 to make. A can of pineapple rings cost 30 cents, maraschino cherries were 25 cents, and the cake batter was simple and cheap. Pineapple upside-down cake was served at dinner parties, potlucks, and any occasion that called for something impressive. Marble cake was the 1950s cake that looked fancy but required no special skills: a simple yellow cake batter divided in half, with cocoa powder stirred into 1/2. Then the 2 batters swirled together in the pan to create a marbled effect. The cake was baked in a bunt pan or loaf pan, then drizzled with a simple vanilla glaze made from powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla extract. The cake cost under $2 to make and looked elegant on a cake stand. The swirls of chocolate and vanilla were visible in every slice, and the vanilla glaze added sweetness and shine. Marble cake was served at afternoon teas. Coconut layer cake was the 1950s and 1960s celebration cake reserved for weddings, Easter, and Christmas. The cake was made from 2 or 3 layers of white or yellow cake, filled with a simple cream filling made from cooked milk, sugar, and cornstarch, then frosted with fluffy white frosting, and covered entirely in sweetened shredded coconut. The result was tall, snowy, impressive, and sweet. The cake cost under $2 to make. Shredded coconut was 30 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were basic baking supplies. The first 10 cakes were 1950s classics: yellow layer, devil's food, white cake, spice, pound cake, angel food, chocolate sheet, pineapple upside down, marble, and coconut layer. But the next 10 go deeper: applesauce, lemon chiffon, orange, prune, date nut, gingerbread, burnt sugar, mahogany, Lady Baltimore, and Lord Baltimore. Applesauce cake was a 1950s and 1960s budget cake made with a cup of unsweetened applesauce mixed into a spiced cake batter along with cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, flour, sugar, eggs, and oil. The applesauce added moisture and sweetness, and the cake baked up dense, moist, and warmly spiced. The top was sprinkled with cinnamon sugar before baking, creating a sweet, crunchy crust. The cake cost under $2 to make. Applesauce was cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Applesauce cake was served plain, without frosting, and it was perfect for breakfast, snack time, or dessert. The cake was moist enough to last for days, and it tasted better the second day when the spices had time to deepen. Applesauce cake was the cake that used up leftover applesauce and turned it into something special. Applesauce cake was humble. Lemon chiffon was light and sophisticated. Lemon chiffon cake was a 1950s and 1960s elegant cake made with a chiffon batter, eggs separated, yolks mixed with oil, lemon juice, and lemon zest, then folded with stiffly beaten egg whites to create a light, airy batter. The cake was baked in a tube pan, cooled upside down like angel food, then drizzled with a lemon glaze made from powdered sugar and lemon juice. The cake cost under $2 to make. Lemons were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were basic. Lemon chiffon cake was lighter than pound cake, but richer than angel food, with a bright, tangy lemon flavor and a tender, moist crumb. The lemon glaze added sweetness and shine, and the cake was served at spring and summer gatherings, showers, and teas. Lemon chiffon was the cake that felt fancy but required no frosting. Lemon was tangy. Orange cake was sweeter and sunnier. Orange cake was a 1950s and 1960s citrus cake made with fresh orange juice, orange zest, butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. The batter was bright, fragrant, and golden, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and moist. The orange buttercream was made from butter, powdered sugar, orange juice, and orange zest beaten until smooth and fluffy. The cake cost under $2 to make. Oranges were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Orange cake was served at spring and summer gatherings, and it was lighter and sweeter than lemon cake. The orange buttercream was creamy, tangy, and sweet, and it paired perfectly with the soft, citrusy cake. Orange cake was the cake that tasted like sunshine and felt like a celebration even when it cost almost nothing. Orange was sunny, but prune cake was darker, richer, and misunderstood. Prune cake was a 1950s and 1960s misunderstood cake made with cooked mashed prunes stirred into a spiced cake batter with cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, buttermilk, and oil. The prunes added moisture, sweetness, and a deep, rich flavor, and the cake baked up dark, dense, and moist. The butter frosting was simple: butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla beaten until smooth. The cake cost under $2 to make. Prunes were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Prune cake was served at potlucks, and it tasted better the second day when the spices had time to meld. Prune cake was the cake that tasted better than its name suggested. Prune cake was misunderstood. Date nut cake was loved by everyone who tried it. Date nut cake was a 1950s and 1960s holiday cake made with chopped dates, chopped walnuts or pecans, butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. The dates were often soaked in boiling water to soften them before stirring into the batter, and the nuts added crunch and richness. The cake was dense, moist, and sweet, with a deep caramel-like flavor from the dates. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich. The cake cost under $2 to make. Dates were cheap, and nuts were affordable in bulk. The dates added natural sweetness, and the nuts added texture. Date nut cake was the cake that tasted like the holidays. The first 15 cakes were 1950s staples: layer cakes, sheet cakes, chiffon cakes, and fruit cakes. But the next 5 go deeper into vintage territory: gingerbread with molasses, burnt sugar cake, mahogany cake, Lady Baltimore with fig filling, and Lord Baltimore with nut filling. These weren't just cakes, they were heirlooms. Glaze. Gingerbread cake was a 1950s and 1960s winter staple made with molasses, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, butter, and buttermilk. The batter was dark, thick, and fragrant, and the cake baked up dense, moist, and warmly spiced. The molasses glaze was simple. Molasses thinned with a little butter and water, then drizzled over the warm cake. The cake cost under $2 to make. Molasses was cheap, and the spices were pantry staples. Gingerbread was the cake that tasted like home and felt like tradition. When gingerbread felt too simple, burnt sugar cake offered complexity and elegance. Burnt sugar cake was a 1950s and 1960s sophisticated cake made with burnt sugar syrup. Sugar melted in a skillet until dark amber and almost smoking, then mixed with boiling water to create a caramel-flavored syrup. The syrup was stirred into a butter cake batter along with eggs, flour, and milk, and the cake baked up golden, tender, and deeply caramel-flavored. The caramel icing was made from the same burnt sugar syrup, butter, and powdered sugar. The flavor was caramel, butterscotch, and slightly bitter, and the icing was smooth and glossy. Burnt sugar was complex. Mahogany cake was even deeper and richer. Mahogany cake was a 1950s and 1960s deep chocolate cake made with cocoa powder, hot coffee, buttermilk, and a touch of red food coloring to give it a reddish-brown hue. The cake was richer and darker than Devil's Food, with a fine crumb and a deep chocolate flavor. The frosting was typically chocolate buttercream or fudge icing. The cake cost under $2 to make. Cocoa powder was cheap, and buttermilk was 25 cents. Mahogany cake was the cake that chocolate lovers requested by name. Mahogany was intense. Lady Baltimore was elegant and southern. Lady Baltimore cake was a 1950s and 1960s Southern heirloom cake made with white cake layers, filled with a cooked filling of chopped figs, raisins, chopped nuts, and sometimes a splash of sherry or brandy, then frosted with fluffy white frosting. The cake was elegant, tall, and impressive, with a sweet, fruity filling and a cloud-like frosting. The cake cost under $2 to make. Figs and raisins were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were basic. Lady Baltimore cake was served at weddings, showers, and special occasions, and it was the cake that felt like Southern tradition, and it was always worth it. Lady Baltimore was fruity. Lord Baltimore was nutty and rich. Lord Baltimore cake was the companion to Lady Baltimore, a yellow cake filled with a cooked filling of chopped nuts, walnuts or pecans, dried cherries or maraschino cherries, crushed macaroons, and sometimes a splash of brandy, then frosted with fluffy white frosting or buttercream. The cake was rich, nutty, and impressive. The cake cost under $2 to make. Nuts were affordable in bulk, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Lord Baltimore cake was served at weddings, holidays, and formal gatherings, and it was the cake that paired with Lady Baltimore at fancy events. The filling was crunchy, sweet, and rich, and the frosting was smooth and creamy, refined, rich, and unforgettable. Lord Baltimore was refined, but rarer cakes were coming next, with technique. The first 20 cakes were classics and heirlooms: layer cakes, sheet cakes, chiffon, fruit cakes, and southern traditions. But the next 10 go into rare vintage territory: Wellesley fudge, scripture cake, Boston cream pie, Lane cake, tomato soup, sauerkraut, oatmeal, mayonnaise, and vinegar cakes. These were the forgotten ones. Wellesley fudge cake was a 1950s and 1960s chocolate cake named after Wellesley College, where it was reportedly served in the dining halls and became famous among alumni. The cake was made with cocoa powder, hot water, butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, and it baked up dark, dense, moist, and intensely chocolatey. The texture was fudgy and rich, almost brownie-like, and the cake was typically frosted with a simple chocolate buttercream or fudge icing. Some versions included sour cream or buttermilk to add tanginess and moisture. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Cocoa powder was 30 cents, butter was 50 cents, eggs were 50 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Wellesley fudge cake was served at special occasions, birthdays, and gatherings where serious chocolate lovers were present. The cake was dense enough to slice thin, and it held up well for transport to potlucks and church suppers. The flavor was pure, deep chocolate with no distractions, no spices, no fruit, no nuts, just chocolate, butter, and sugar. Wellesley fudge cake disappeared from home baking when boxed cake mixes became popular, and younger generations stopped learning the from-scratch techniques their mothers and grandmothers had mastered. The cake required careful mixing and precise baking times, and it was easy to overbake and dry out. But when made correctly, Wellesley fudge cake was the ultimate chocolate cake, rich, fudgy, and unforgettable. Scripture cake was different. It required a Bible to decode the ingredients. Scripture cake was a 1950s and 1960s novelty cake with a recipe written entirely in Bible verses. Each ingredient was listed as a scripture reference, and the baker had to look up the verses to decode what to use. For example, 1 cup Judges 5:25 meant butter, 3 cups Jeremiah 6:20 meant sugar, and 6 Jeremiah 17:11 meant eggs. The cake itself was a spiced fruit cake with raisins, figs, almonds, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, and it was dense, moist, and richly flavored. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Dried fruit and nuts were affordable in bulk, and the spices were pantry staples. Scripture cake was served at church gatherings, Sunday school socials, and religious celebrations, and it was often given as a gift with the recipe card included, so the recipient could decode it themselves. The cake was a conversation starter, a teaching tool, and a way to make baking feel educational and spiritual. Scripture cake disappeared from home baking when novelty recipes fell out of favor and younger generations preferred straightforward ingredient lists. The cake required a Bible, patience, and a willingness to spend time decoding verses, and most modern bakers found it too complicated. But for those who grew up with scripture cake, it was a beloved tradition, a cake that combined faith, family, and baking into one dense, spiced, fruit-studded loaf. By the time Boston cream pie arrived, cakes were becoming pies, or were they? Boston cream pie was a 1950s and 1960s classic that wasn't a pie at all. It was a cake. The dessert consisted of 2 layers of yellow sponge cake filled with a thick, creamy vanilla custard, then topped with a glossy chocolate ganache. The cake was soft and tender, the custard was smooth and rich, and the chocolate topping was shiny and slightly firm. Boston cream pie was elegant, impressive, and deceptively simple. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Eggs were 50 cents, milk was 25 cents, butter was 50 cents, and chocolate was 30 cents. The custard was made on the stovetop by cooking milk, sugar, egg yolks, and cornstarch until thick and smooth, then cooling before spreading between the cake layers. The chocolate topping was made by melting chocolate with butter and a little cream, then pouring over the top of the cake and letting it drip down the sides. Boston cream pie was served at birthdays, special occasions, and formal dinners, and it was the dessert that looked like it came from a bakery but cost almost nothing to make. The cake required 3 separate steps: baking the cake, making the custard, and making the chocolate topping. But each step was simple and forgiving. Boston cream pie disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than elegance and effort, but it remained a beloved classic in bakeries and restaurants. If Boston cream pie felt too fancy, Lane cake brought Southern elegance with bourbon. Lane cake was a 1950s and 1960s Southern heirloom cake, named after Emma Rylander Lane, who published the recipe in the early 1900s. The cake consisted of white or yellow cake layers filled with a cooked filling made from egg yolks, sugar, butter, raisins, chopped pecans, shredded coconut, and a generous splash of bourbon or brandy. The filling was thick, rich, sweet, and boozy, and the cake was frosted with fluffy white frosting or left plain to showcase the filling. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Raisins were cheap, pecans were affordable in bulk, and bourbon was a pantry staple in Southern households. Lane cake was served at Christmas, weddings, and special occasions, and it was the cake that adults loved and children avoided because of the strong bourbon flavor. The filling was cooked on the stovetop until thick and glossy, then cooled slightly before spreading between the cake layers. The bourbon added depth, warmth, and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the filling. Lane cake disappeared from home baking when recipes with alcohol fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred milder, less boozy desserts. The cake required patience, skill, and a willingness to cook a custard-like filling without scrambling the eggs. But for those who grew up with Lane cake, it was the ultimate Southern celebration cake, rich, boozy, and unforgettable. Lane cake was boozy. Robert E. Lee. Cake was elegant and citrusy. Robert E. Lee cake was a 1950s and 1960s Southern layer cake made with yellow cake layers filled with a cooked lemon filling made from lemon juice, lemon zest, sugar, butter, and egg yolks, then frosted with fluffy white frosting or lemon buttercream. The cake was tall, elegant, and impressively Southern, with a bright, tangy lemon filling that cut through the sweetness of the frosting. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Lemons were cheap, eggs were 50 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Robert E. Lee cake was named after the Confederate general and was served at Southern gatherings, holidays, and formal dinners. The lemon filling was cooked on the stovetop until thick and glossy, then cooled before spreading between the cake layers. The filling was tangy, rich, and slightly tart, and it paired perfectly with the soft, buttery cake and the sweet, fluffy frosting. Robert E. Lee cake disappeared from home baking when regional cakes fell out of favor and the name became controversial. The cake required effort, baking the layers, cooking the filling, and frosting the cake, but the result was stunning and delicious. Robert E. Lee cake was the Southern cake that tasted like spring, looked like elegance, and required skill and patience to make correctly. Robert E. Lee was elegant, But regional cakes were about to get stranger. The first 25 cakes were classics, heirlooms, and vintage treasures, and rare recipes like Wellesley fudge and scripture cake. But the next 5 go into truly odd territory. Tomato soup, sauerkraut. These weren't just forgotten, they were controversial. Tomato soup cake was a Depression-era cake that survived into the 1950s and 1960s, made with a can of condensed tomato soup stirred into a spiced cake batter, along with sugar, butter, eggs, flour, baking soda, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The tomato soup added moisture, sweetness, and a subtle tang, and the spices masked any tomato flavor. The cake baked up dark, red-brown, dense, moist, and warmly spiced, and it was typically frosted with cream cheese, frosting, or simple buttercream. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A can of tomato soup cost 15 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Tomato soup cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and most people had no idea there was tomato soup in the cake until they were told. The cake was moist enough to last for days, and it tasted like a spice cake with a hint of acidity that made it interesting and complex. Tomato soup cake disappeared from home baking when novelty ingredient cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations found the idea of tomato soup in a cake unappetizing. The cake was easy to make and required no special skills, but the ingredient list made people uncomfortable. Tomato soup cake was the cake that tasted better than it sounded, and those who tried it were always surprised by how good it was. What came next made tomato soup seem normal. Sauerkraut cake used pickled cabbage. Sauerkraut cake was a 1950s and 1960s novelty cake made with drained, rinsed, and finely chopped sauerkraut stirred into a chocolate cake batter. The sauerkraut added moisture, texture, and a slight tanginess, but once baked, it was completely undetectable. The chocolate masked the flavor, and the sauerkraut strands looked like shredded coconut. The cake was frosted with chocolate buttercream or fudge icing, and most people had no idea there was sauerkraut in the cake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A can of sauerkraut cost 20 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Sauerkraut cake was served at potlucks and gatherings, often as a conversation starter or a dare. Bakers would serve the cake without revealing the secret ingredient, and guests would guess what made the cake so moist and tender. The sauerkraut added fiber, moisture, and a subtle tang that balanced the sweetness of the chocolate. Sauerkraut cake disappeared from home baking when novelty ingredient cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations found the idea of pickled cabbage in a cake too strange. The cake was easy to make and tasted delicious, but the ingredient list made people uncomfortable. Sauerkraut cake was the ultimate trust-me cake. It sounded terrible but tasted amazing, and those who tried it were always surprised. Sauerkraut was shocking. Oatmeal cake was wholesome and beloved. Oatmeal cake was a 1950s and 1960s beloved cake made with cooked oatmeal stirred into a butter cake batter, along with brown sugar, eggs, flour, and warm spices. The oatmeal added moisture, texture, and a subtle nuttiness, and the cake baked up dense, moist, and tender. The broiled coconut topping was made by spreading a mixture of butter, brown sugar, cream, shredded coconut, and chopped pecans over the warm cake, then placing it under the broiler until the topping bubbled, caramelized, and turned golden brown. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Oatmeal was cheap, coconut was 30 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Oatmeal cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and it was always one of the first cakes to disappear. The broiled topping was crunchy, sweet, caramelized, and coconutty, and it contrasted perfectly with the soft, moist cake underneath. The cake was best served warm, when the topping was still slightly gooey and the cake was fragrant and tender. Oatmeal cake disappeared from home baking when convenience became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations stopped making cakes that required broiling the topping. The cake was easy to make, but required attention. The topping had to be watched carefully under the broiler to prevent burning. Oatmeal cake was the cake that tasted like comfort, warmth, and home. Oatmeal was comforting, but mayonnaise cake was the ultimate secret ingredient cake. Mayonnaise chocolate cake was a 1950s and 1960s secret ingredient cake made with a full cup of mayonnaise stirred into a chocolate cake batter, along with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, and water. The mayonnaise replaced the butter and eggs, and it added moisture, richness, and a tender crumb. The cake baked up dark, moist, and intensely chocolatey, and most people had no idea there was mayonnaise in the cake until they were told. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A jar of mayonnaise cost around 40 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Mayonnaise cake was served at potlucks, birthdays, and gatherings, and bakers loved it because it was easy, foolproof, and always moist. The mayonnaise kept the cake tender and moist for days, and the chocolate flavor was rich and deep. The cake was typically frosted with chocolate buttercream or fudge icing, and it was one of the most requested cakes at church suppers and potlucks. Mayonnaise cake disappeared from home baking when novelty ingredient cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations found the idea of mayonnaise in a cake unappetizing. The cake was one of the easiest chocolate cakes to make. No creaming butter, no separating eggs, just mix and bake. Mayonnaise cake was the cake that tasted like a bakery cake but required no special skills or ingredients. Mayonnaise was clever. Vinegar cake was even simpler and eggless. Vinegar cake was a Depression-era eggless chocolate cake that survived into the 1950s and 1960s, made with flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, oil, vinegar, and water. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda to create lift and lightness, replacing the eggs, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and surprisingly moist. The cake was typically frosted with chocolate buttercream or a simple powdered sugar glaze. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. All the ingredients were pantry staples, and no eggs or butter were required. Vinegar cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and it was the cake that saved the day when eggs were scarce or budgets were tight. The vinegar was completely undetectable in the finished cake. The chocolate masked any tang, and the texture was soft and tender. The cake was easy to make, required only one bowl, and could be baked in a sheet pan or layer pans. Vinegar cake was made by mixing the dry ingredients together in a bowl, then stirring in the oil, vinegar, and water until smooth. The batter was thin and pourable, and it was poured into a greased pan and baked until springy and firm. The cake required no mixer, no creaming butter and sugar, and no separating eggs. It was the ultimate beginner cake, and children learned to bake by making vinegar cake first. Vinegar cake disappeared from home baking when eggs became affordable and readily available, and younger generations stopped needing eggless cake recipes. The cake was one of the simplest cakes to make. No mixer required, just stir and bake, and it was perfect for beginners and children learning to bake. Vinegar cake was the cake that proved you didn't need eggs or butter to make something delicious, and it was the cake that saved celebrations when pantries were bare. Vinegar was simple, but fruit-based cakes were bringing sweetness and color next. The first 30 cakes were classics, heirlooms, and odd ingredient cakes: tomato soup, sauerkraut. But the next 10 go fruitier: banana, strawberry shortcake layers, blueberry buckle, apple stack, peach upside down, and coffee cakes with streusel, crumb, pecans, glaze, and cinnamon swirls. Banana cake was a 1950s and 1960s beloved cake made with mashed ripe bananas stirred into a butter cake batter, along with sugar, eggs, flour, buttermilk, and sometimes a hint of cinnamon or vanilla. The bananas added moisture, sweetness, and a subtle banana flavor, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and incredibly moist. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the sweet banana cake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Overripe bananas were often free or discounted at the grocery store, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Banana cake was the cake that used up bananas that were too ripe to eat, and it was served at potlucks, birthdays, and family gatherings. The cake was moist enough to last for days, and it tasted better the second day when the banana flavor had time to deepen. The cream cheese frosting added tanginess and richness, and it was the perfect complement to the soft, sweet cake. Banana cake was made by mashing ripe bananas with a fork or potato masher until smooth, then stirring them into a standard butter cake batter. The bananas had to be very ripe. The skins should be heavily speckled with brown spots, because underripe bananas didn't add enough sweetness or moisture. The batter was thick and fragrant, and it was baked in layer pans or a sheet pan until golden and springy. The layers were cooled, then stacked and frosted with cream cheese frosting. Banana cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations stopped making cakes that required mashing bananas by hand. The cake was easy to make and required no special skills, but it did require patience to mash the bananas until smooth. Banana cake was the cake that tasted like home, comfort, and resourcefulness. Banana was comforting. Strawberry shortcake became a layer cake next. Strawberry shortcake layer cake was a 1950s and 1960s springtime cake made with white or yellow cake layers filled with fresh sliced strawberries and whipped cream, then frosted with more whipped cream and topped with whole strawberries. The cake was light, fresh, fruity, and elegant, and it was the ultimate celebration cake for spring and summer gatherings. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Fresh strawberries were cheap in season, heavy cream was 50 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were basic baking supplies. Strawberry shortcake layer cake was served at birthdays, showers, graduations, and Mother's Day, and it was the cake that tasted like spring. The whipped cream was light and airy, the strawberries were sweet and juicy, and the cake was soft and tender. The cake had to be assembled close to serving time because the whipped cream and strawberries made the cake soggy if left too long. Strawberry shortcake layer cake was made by baking white or yellow cake layers, cooling them completely, then slicing fresh strawberries and macerating them with a little sugar to release their juices. The whipped cream was made by whipping heavy cream with sugar and vanilla until stiff peaks formed. The layers were stacked with strawberries and whipped cream between each layer. Then the entire cake was frosted with whipped cream and topped with whole fresh strawberries. The result was a tall, beautiful, impressive cake that tasted like summer. Strawberry shortcake layer cake disappeared from home baking when stabilized whipped cream and frozen strawberries became more common, and younger generations preferred convenience over fresh ingredients. The cake required fresh strawberries, real whipped cream, and careful assembly, and it couldn't be made too far in advance. Strawberry shortcake layer cake was the cake that celebrated the season and tasted like summer. Strawberries were fresh, blueberry buckle was rustic and crumbly next, Blueberry buckle cake was a 1950s and 1960s summer cake made with a simple butter cake batter studded with fresh blueberries, topped with a crumb topping made from flour, butter, sugar, and cinnamon, then baked until the topping was golden and crunchy and the cake was soft and moist. The blueberries burst during baking, creating pockets of sweet, tangy fruit throughout the cake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Fresh blueberries were cheap in season, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Blueberry buckle was served for breakfast, dessert, or snack time, and it was the cake that used up fresh blueberries before they went bad. The crumb topping added texture and sweetness, and it stayed crunchy even after the cake cooled. The cake was best served warm, when the blueberries were still slightly juicy and the topping was fragrant and crunchy. Blueberry buckle was made by mixing a simple butter cake batter, folding in fresh blueberries, then pouring the batter into a greased baking pan. The crumb topping was made by mixing flour, sugar, butter, and cinnamon with a fork or pastry blender until crumbly, then sprinkling it over the batter. The cake was baked until the topping was golden and the cake was springy, and it was best served warm with butter or whipped cream. Blueberry buckle disappeared from home baking when coffee cakes and crumb cakes became more common, and younger generations preferred boxed mixes to from-scratch recipes. The cake was simple to make, but required fresh blueberries and a homemade crumb topping, and it couldn't be rushed or simplified. Blueberry buckle was the cake that tasted like summer mornings, fresh fruit, and comfort. And it was the cake that made people remember their grandmother's kitchens. Blueberry was summer. Apple stack cake brought Appalachian tradition next. Apple stack cake was a 1950s and 1960s Appalachian heirloom cake made with thin layers of spiced cookie-like cake, stacked with cooked dried apple filling between each layer. The cake required patience. Each layer was baked separately, cooled, then stacked with the apple filling, and the cake had to sit for at least a day before serving so the layers could soften and meld together. The result was a tall, impressive, rustic cake with a unique texture and a deep apple spice flavor. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Dried apples were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Apple stack cake was served at weddings, church gatherings, and holiday celebrations in Appalachian communities, and it was the cake that represented tradition, patience, and resourcefulness. The dried apple filling was cooked with sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of apple cider until thick and spreadable, and it tasted like concentrated apple pie filling. Apple stack cake was made by baking thin layers of spiced dough in round cake pans, then cooling each layer completely before stacking. The apple filling was spread between each layer, and the cake was left uncovered or lightly covered for at least a day so the layers could absorb moisture from the filling and soften. The finished cake was dense, moist, and packed with apple flavor, and it was sliced thin to serve. Apple stack cake disappeared from home baking when regional cakes fell out of favor and younger generations stopped learning the traditional techniques. The cake required time, effort, and patience, baking each layer separately, cooking the filling, stacking the layers, and waiting a day before serving. Apple stack cake was the cake that connected families to their Appalachian roots and tasted like heritage. Apple stack was tradition. Peach upside down brought Southern summer next. Peach upside-down cake was a 1950s and 1960s summer variation of pineapple upside-down cake, made with fresh or canned peach slices arranged in a skillet with butter and brown sugar, then covered with yellow cake batter and baked until golden. The cake was flipped upside down while still warm, revealing a glossy, caramelized peach topping that was sweet, sticky, and beautiful. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Fresh peaches were cheap in season, and canned peaches were affordable year-round. Peach upside-down cake was served at summer gatherings, church suppers, and family dinners, and it was the cake that tasted like southern summer. The peaches were sweet, tender and caramelized, and the brown sugar topping was glossy and sticky. The cake was best served warm, when the topping was still slightly gooey, and the cake was fragrant and tender. Peach upside-down cake was made by melting butter and brown sugar in a cast-iron skillet or cake pan, arranging peach slices in a decorative pattern over the butter and sugar, then pouring yellow cake batter over the peaches and baking until golden and springy. The cake was flipped onto a plate while still warm, and the peaches stayed in place, creating a beautiful glossy topping. The cake was served warm or at room temperature, often with whipped cream or vanilla ice cream. Peach upside-down cake disappeared from home baking when fresh peaches became less common in home kitchens, and convenience became more important than seasonal baking. The cake required fresh or canned peaches, a cast-iron skillet or cake pan, and careful flipping to avoid breaking the cake. Peach upside-down cake was the cake that celebrated summer fruit and tasted like home, and it was the cake that made people remember southern summers. Peach was seasonal. Sour cream coffee cake was year-round and perfect for breakfast. Sour cream coffee cake was a 1950s and 1960s breakfast and brunch staple made with sour cream stirred into a butter cake batter, layered with a cinnamon sugar streusel, then baked until golden and tender. The sour cream added moisture, tanginess, and a tender crumb, and the streusel added sweetness, crunch, and cinnamon flavor. The cake was typically baked in a tube pan or square pan and served plain, without frosting. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Sour cream was 25 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Sour cream coffee cake was served at breakfasts, brunches, church gatherings, and afternoon teas, and it was the cake that paired perfectly with coffee. The streusel was layered in the middle and on top, creating pockets of cinnamon sugar throughout the cake. The cake was moist, tender, and slightly tangy, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. Sour cream coffee cake was made by mixing a standard butter cake batter, stirring in sour cream, then layering half the batter in a greased pan, sprinkling a generous layer of cinnamon sugar streusel over the batter, then covering with the remaining batter and topping with more streusel. The cake was baked until a toothpick came out clean, and it was best served warm or at room temperature. Sour cream coffee cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations preferred boxed mixes and store-bought coffee cakes. The cake required layering the batter and streusel carefully, and it couldn't be rushed. Sour cream coffee cake was the cake that tasted like Sunday mornings, fresh coffee, and comfort, and it was the cake that made people slow down and enjoy breakfast. Sour cream was elegant. Brown sugar crumb cake was simpler and sweeter next. Brown sugar crumb cake was a 1950s and 1960s simple breakfast cake made with a tender butter cake base topped with a thick layer of brown sugar crumb topping made from flour, brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon. The topping was thick, crunchy, and sweet, and it was the best part of the cake. The cake was baked in a square or rectangular pan and served plain, without frosting. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Brown sugar was cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staple. Brown sugar crumb cake was served at breakfasts, brunches, and coffee gatherings, and it was the cake that required almost no effort but tasted homemade and delicious. The crumb topping was thick and generous, and it stayed crunchy even after the cake cooled. The cake was moist, tender, and slightly sweet, and it paired perfectly with coffee or tea. Brown sugar crumb cake was made by mixing a simple butter cake batter, pouring it into a greased pan, then making the crumb topping by mixing flour, brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon with a fork or pastry blender until crumbly. The crumb topping was sprinkled generously over the batter, and the cake was baked until the topping was golden and the cake was springy. The cake was best served warm or at room temperature, and it was perfect for breakfast or an afternoon snack. Brown sugar crumb cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations preferred store-bought crumb cakes and coffee cakes. The cake was simple to make. Mix the batter, make the crumb topping, sprinkle it on, and bake. But it required a homemade crumb topping that couldn't be replicated with a boxed mix. Brown sugar crumb cake was the cake that tasted like simplicity, comfort, and home. Brown sugar was simple. Buttermilk coffee cake added pecans and richness next. Topping buttermilk coffee cake was a 1950s and 1960s breakfast cake made with buttermilk stirred into a butter cake batter, topped with a pecan streusel made from chopped pecans, brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon, then baked until golden and tender. The buttermilk added moisture, tanginess, and a tender crumb, and the pecan topping added crunch, richness, and nutty flavor. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Buttermilk was 25 cents, pecans were affordable in bulk, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Buttermilk coffee cake was served at breakfasts, brunches, and church gatherings, and it was the cake that tasted like Southern hospitality. The pecan topping was crunchy, sweet, and buttery, and it contrasted perfectly with the soft, tender cake underneath. The cake was moist, tangy, and slightly sweet, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. Buttermilk coffee cake was made by mixing a standard butter cake batter, stirring in buttermilk, then pouring the batter into a greased pan. The pecan streusel was made by mixing chopped pecans, brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon with a fork until crumbly, then sprinkling it generously over the batter. The cake was baked until the topping was golden and the cake was springy, and it was best served warm or at room temperature. Buttermilk coffee cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations preferred store-bought coffee cakes and boxed mixes. The cake required a homemade pecan topping and careful layering, and it couldn't be rushed. Buttermilk coffee cake was the cake that tasted like Sunday mornings, fresh coffee, and Southern comfort, and it was the cake that made people feel welcome and cared for. Buttermilk was Southern. Honey bun cake was sticky, sweet, and irresistible next. Honey bun cake was a 1950s and 1960s sweet breakfast cake made with a simple yellow cake batter swirled with a cinnamon sugar filling, baked until golden, then drizzled with a sweet glaze made from powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla. The cake was sticky, sweet, cinnamony, and irresistible, and it tasted like a cross between a cinnamon roll and a coffee cake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. All the ingredients were pantry staples, and the cake required no special skills or equipment. Honey bun cake was served at breakfasts, brunches, and gatherings, and it was the cake that everyone loved. The cinnamon sugar swirl ran through the cake in ribbons, creating pockets of sweetness and spice, and the glaze added extra sweetness and shine. The cake was best served warm when the glaze was still slightly runny and the cinnamon swirl was fragrant and gooey. Honey bun cake was made by mixing a simple yellow cake batter, pouring half the batter into a greased pan, sprinkling a generous layer of cinnamon sugar over the batter, then covering with the remaining batter and swirling with a knife to create ribbons of cinnamon throughout. The cake was baked until golden and springy, then drizzled with a sweet glaze while still warm. The glaze soaked into the warm cake, making it even more moist and sweet. Honey bun cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations preferred store-bought cinnamon rolls and coffee cakes. The cake was easy to make, but required swirling the cinnamon sugar filling into the batter without overmixing, and it couldn't be rushed. Honey bun cake was the cake that tasted like childhood, cinnamon rolls, and comfort. Honey bun was sticky. Cinnamon swirl cake was elegant and layered to finish. Cinnamon swirl cake was a 1950s and 1960s elegant coffee cake made with a tender butter cake batter layered with a cinnamon sugar filling, swirled with a knife to create a marbled effect, then baked in a bunt pan or loaf pan until golden and tender. The result was a beautiful swirled cake with ribbons of cinnamon throughout, and it was typically drizzled with a simple vanilla glaze. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. All the ingredients were pantry staples, and the cake required no special skills beyond swirling the batter. Cinnamon swirl cake was served at breakfasts, brunches, teas, and gatherings, and it was the cake that looked impressive but was easy to make. The cinnamon swirl ran through the cake in ribbons, creating pockets of sweetness and spice, and the vanilla glaze added extra sweetness and shine. The cake was moist, tender, and fragrant, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. Cinnamon swirl cake was made by mixing a standard butter cake batter, pouring half the batter into a greased bunt pan or loaf pan, sprinkling a generous layer of cinnamon sugar over the batter, then covering with the remaining batter and swirling with a knife or skewer to create a marbled effect. The cake was baked until golden and springy, then drizzled with a simple vanilla glaze made from powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla extract. Cinnamon swirl cake disappeared from home baking when convenience and speed became more important than from-scratch baking, and younger generations preferred store-bought coffee cakes and boxed mixes. The cake required careful layering and swirling to create the marbled effect, and it couldn't be rushed. Cinnamon swirl cake was the cake that tasted like elegance, cinnamon, and home. Cinnamon swirl was elegant. The first 40 cakes were classics, but the next 20 go deeper. Bunt cakes with fudge centers, jello cakes, holiday cakes, icebox cakes, and the oddest cakes of all. These were the showstoppers. Tunnel of Fudge Bunt Cake was a 1960s iconic cake that became famous after winning the Pillsbury Bake-Off in 1966. The cake was made with a rich chocolate batter mixed with chopped walnuts and a full box of chocolate fudge frosting mix, then baked in a bunt pan until the outside was firm and the inside stayed soft, fudgy and gooey, creating a tunnel of fudge through the center. The cake was revolutionary because it was intentionally underbaked, and the fudge center was part of the design, not a mistake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. A box of fudge frosting mix cost around 30 cents. Walnuts were affordable in bulk, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Tunnel of Fudge cake was served at special occasions, dinner parties, and gatherings, and it became one of the most requested cakes of the decade. The texture was complex, firm and brownie-like on the outside, soft and fudgy in the center, and the walnuts added crunch and richness. The cake had to be made with a specific brand of fudge frosting mix to work properly, and when that mix was discontinued in the 1970s, home bakers struggled to recreate the original recipe. Tunnel of Fudge cake disappeared from home baking when the original fudge frosting mix was discontinued, and younger generations stopped learning the precise technique required to create the fudge tunnel. The cake required careful baking. Too long and the center hardened, too short and the outside stayed raw. Bakers had to trust the recipe and resist the urge to overbake, which was difficult for those trained to bake cakes until a toothpick came out clean. Tunnel of Fudge cake was the cake that launched a generation of bunt cake mania, and it remained one of the most beloved and mysterious cakes of the 1960s. The cake was served plain, dusted with powdered sugar, or drizzled with a simple chocolate glaze, and it was always sliced to show off the fudgy center. The walnuts were essential. They added texture and prevented the center from becoming too gooey, and the cake tasted best when served slightly warm. Tunnel of Fudge cake was the cake that proved underbaking could be intentional, delicious, and impressive. Tunnel of Fudge was revolutionary. Sock it to me cake was playful and nutty. Sock it to me cake was a 1960s and 1970s playful bunt cake made with a sour cream yellow cake batter layered with a cinnamon sugar pecan filling in the center, then baked until golden and tender. The cake was drizzled with a simple vanilla or powdered sugar glaze, and the name came from the popular catchphrase, "Sock it to me," from the television show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The cake was fun, flavorful, and became a staple at potlucks and gatherings. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Sour cream was 25 cents, pecans were affordable in bulk, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Sock it to me cake was made by pouring half the batter into a greased bunt pan, sprinkling the cinnamon sugar pecan filling over the batter, then covering with the remaining batter and baking until a toothpick came out clean. The result was a moist, tender cake with a ribbon of cinnamon pecan filling running through the center, and the glaze added sweetness and shine. Sock it to me cake was served at birthdays, church suppers, potlucks, and any occasion that called for something sweet and fun. The sour cream made the cake incredibly moist and tender, and the cinnamon pecan filling added texture, warmth, and sweetness. The cake was easy to make, required no special skills, and looked impressive on a cake stand. The name alone made people smile, and the cake tasted as good as it sounded. Sock it to me cake disappeared from home baking when bunt cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations stopped learning the layering technique required to create the cinnamon pecan ribbon. The cake required careful assembly. The filling had to be sprinkled evenly and covered completely with the remaining batter to prevent it from sinking or burning, but the result was always worth the effort. Sock it to me cake was the cake that tasted like the 1960s, felt like a party, and brought back memories of Laugh-In, bell-bottoms, and bunt pans on every kitchen counter. The cake was best served at room temperature, sliced thin to show off the cinnamon pecan ribbon, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. The glaze was optional but recommended, and it added extra sweetness and a glossy finish. Sock it to me cake was the cake that made people laugh and made them ask for the recipe. Sock it to me was playful. Rum-glazed bunt cake was sophisticated and boozy. Rum-glazed bunt cake was a 1960s and 1970s elegant cake made with a simple yellow or vanilla bunt cake soaked in a rum glaze made from butter, sugar, water, and dark rum. The glaze was poured over the warm cake immediately after baking, and the cake absorbed the glaze, becoming moist, rich, and boozy. The result was a sophisticated adult cake that tasted like the holidays and felt like a celebration. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Dark rum was a pantry staple in many households, and the rest of the ingredients were basic baking supplies. Rum-glazed bunt cake was served at Christmas, New Year's, dinner parties, and any occasion that called for something elegant and impressive. The rum glaze was made by simmering butter, sugar, and water together until the sugar dissolved, then stirring in the rum and pouring the hot glaze over the warm cake. The cake absorbed the glaze, and the alcohol cooked off slightly, leaving behind a deep, rich rum flavor. Rum-glazed bunt cake was not for children. The rum flavor was strong and unmistakable, and it was the cake that adults requested by name. The cake was moist, tender, and buttery, with a deep rum flavor that lingered on the tongue. The glaze soaked into every crevice of the bunt cake, and the result was a cake that tasted like it had been soaking in rum for days. The cake was best served at room temperature, sliced thin, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. Rum-glazed bunt cake disappeared from home baking when recipes with alcohol fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred milder, less boozy desserts. The cake required confidence. Pouring hot rum glaze over a warm cake felt risky, and many bakers worried the cake would become soggy or the glaze would pool at the bottom. But when made correctly, rum-glazed bunt cake was the ultimate sophisticated dessert, and it was the cake that tasted like elegance, celebration, and the holidays. The cake was often dusted with powdered sugar before serving, and it paired perfectly with coffee or after-dinner drinks. The rum glaze was essential. Without it, the cake was plain and ordinary, but with it, the cake became something special, memorable, and delicious. Rum-glazed bunt cake was the cake that made home bakers feel like professionals. Rum glaze was sophisticated, lemon jello cake was bright, tangy, and easy. Lemon jello cake was a 1960s and 1970s easy cake made with a box of yellow cake mix, a box of lemon jello powder, eggs, oil, and water. The jello powder was mixed into the cake batter, and the cake baked up bright yellow, moist, tender, and intensely lemon-flavored. The cake was poked with holes while still warm, then drizzled with a lemon glaze made from powdered sugar and lemon juice, which soaked into the holes and made the cake even more moist and flavorful. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. A box of cake mix cost around 30 cents, a box of Jell-O cost 15 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Lemon Jell-O cake was served at spring and summer gatherings, potlucks, church suppers, and any occasion that called for something bright, tangy, and refreshing. The Jell-O powder intensified the lemon flavor and added moisture, and the glaze added extra sweetness and tang. The cake was easy to make, required no special skills, and looked impressive on a cake stand. Lemon Jell-O cake was the cake that used boxed mixes and turned them into something special. The Jell-O trick, mixing the powder into the batter, was a revelation for home bakers, and it became a popular technique for adding flavor and moisture to cakes. The cake was baked in a 9-13 pan or a bunt pan, and it was served plain or with whipped cream and fresh berries. The lemon flavor was bright and tangy, and the cake was moist and tender, with a fine crumb that melted on the tongue. Lemon Jell-O cake disappeared from home baking when from-scratch baking became more popular and younger generations rejected boxed mixes and processed ingredients. The cake was easy, fast, and foolproof, but it relied on convenience products that fell out of favor. Lemon Jell-O cake was the cake that saved time, tasted delicious, and used ingredients that were already in the pantry. The cake was best served chilled, and it was perfect for summer picnics, potlucks, and outdoor gatherings. The glaze was essential. It added moisture and extra lemon flavor, and the cake tasted better the second day when the glaze had time to soak in completely. Lemon Jell-O cake was the cake that proved convenience could be delicious, and it was the cake that everyone loved. Lemon Jell-O was tangy. Orange Jell-O. Cake was sweeter and sunnier. Orange Jell-O cake was a 1960s and 1970s sunny cake made with a box of yellow cake mix, a box of orange Jell-O powder, eggs, oil, and a can of mandarin oranges with their juice. The mandarin oranges were stirred into the batter, and the cake baked up bright orange, moist, tender, and incredibly flavorful. The cake was topped with a creamy frosting made from whipped topping, vanilla pudding mix, crushed pineapple, and sometimes more mandarin oranges. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. A box of cake mix cost around 30 cents. A box of Jell-O cost 15 cents, and a can of mandarin oranges cost 25 cents. Orange Jell-O cake was served at spring and summer gatherings, potlucks, church suppers, and any occasion that called for something bright, sweet, and refreshing. The mandarin oranges added moisture, sweetness, and bits of fruit throughout the cake, and the creamy frosting was light, fluffy, and tangy from the pineapple. Orange Jell-O cake was the cake that used convenience products and turned them into something special. The combination of Jell-O powder, mandarin oranges, and whipped topping frosting was a revelation for home bakers, and it became one of the most popular cakes of the 1970s. The cake was easy to make, required no special skills, and looked impressive on a cake stand. The orange flavor was bright and sunny, and the cake was moist and tender, with a fine crumb and bits of mandarin orange throughout. Orange Jell-O cake disappeared from home baking when from-scratch baking became more popular and younger generations rejected boxed mixes, canned fruit, and processed ingredients. The cake was easy, fast, and foolproof, but it relied on convenience products that fell out of favor. Orange Jell-O cake was the cake that saved time, tasted delicious, and used ingredients that were already in the pantry. The cake was best served chilled, and it was perfect for summer picnics, potlucks, and outdoor gatherings. The frosting was essential. It added creaminess and extra flavor, and the cake tasted better the second day when the flavors had time to meld. Orange Jell-O cake was the cake that proved convenience could be delicious, and it was the cake that everyone loved and requested the recipe for. Orange Jell-O was sunny, but holiday cakes were about to bring tradition and fruit. Lemon and orange, but the next 5 go traditional: fruit cake with candied fruit, election cake, Moravian sugar cake, hummingbird, and Italian cream. These were the holiday and celebration cakes. Traditional fruit cake was a 1950s and 1960s holiday cake made with candied fruit, raisins, dried currants, chopped nuts, butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The batter was thick, dense, and packed with fruit and nuts, and the cake was baked slowly in a low oven until firm and golden. The finished cake was often soaked in brandy or rum, wrapped tightly, and aged for weeks or months before serving. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Candied fruit was 30 cents, raisins were cheap, and nuts were affordable in bulk. Traditional fruit cake was served at Christmas, and it was the cake that divided people into 2 camps, those who loved it and those who hated it. The cake was dense, rich, and intensely fruity, with a deep, complex flavor from the spices and the alcohol. The candied fruit added sweetness and color, and the nuts added crunch and richness. Traditional fruit cake was made weeks or even months before Christmas, and it was soaked in brandy or rum every few days to keep it moist and flavorful. The cake was wrapped tightly in cheesecloth or wax paper, stored in a cool, dark place, and aged like wine. The aging process mellowed the flavors, softened the texture, and allowed the alcohol to soak into every bite. The result was a cake that tasted rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. Traditional fruit cake disappeared from home baking when younger generations rejected the dense, fruit-packed texture and the strong alcohol flavor. The cake became a punchline, the gift no one wanted, the cake that lasted forever, the dessert that was regifted year after year. But for those who grew up with traditional fruitcake, it was a beloved holiday tradition, a cake that took time, effort, and patience to make, and it was the cake that tasted like Christmas. The cake was served in thin slices, often with a cup of tea or coffee, and it was sometimes topped with a simple glaze or left plain. The candied fruit was essential. It added sweetness, color, and texture, and the nuts added richness and crunch. Traditional fruitcake was the cake that lasted for months, traveled well, and made a thoughtful homemade gift. It was the cake that represented tradition, patience, and the holidays. Fruitcake was traditional. Election cake was historical and spiced. Election cake was a 1950s and 1960s historical cake that dated back to colonial America, when it was baked and served at town meetings and election days. The cake was a large, spiced yeast cake made with flour, sugar, butter, eggs, molasses, dried fruit, raisins, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The dough was mixed like bread dough, allowed to rise, then baked in large loaf pans or round pans until golden and fragrant. The result was a dense, moist, spiced cake that tasted like a cross between bread and cake. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Flour was cheap, molasses was a pantry staple, and dried fruit and raisins were affordable. Election cake was served at community gatherings, church events, and historical celebrations, and it was the cake that connected modern bakers to their colonial past. The yeast gave the cake a unique texture, lighter than fruit cake, but denser than regular cake, and the spices and molasses added warmth and depth. The dried fruit and raisins added sweetness and texture, and the cake was best served warm or toasted with butter. Election cake disappeared from home baking when yeast cakes fell out of favor and younger generations stopped learning the traditional techniques required to make bread-based cakes. The cake required patience. The dough had to rise twice, and the baking time was long, and it couldn't be rushed or simplified. Election cake was the cake that tasted like history, tradition, and community. Election cake was best served warm, sliced thick, and spread with butter, and it paired perfectly with tea or cider. The cake lasted for days when wrapped tightly, and it tasted better the second day when the flavors had time to meld. Election cake was the cake that represented democracy, community, and tradition. And it was the cake that modern bakers rediscovered when they wanted to connect with their culinary past. It was the cake that required time, effort, and patience, and it was always worth it. Election cake was historical. Moravian sugar cake was sweet and simple. Moravian sugar cake was a 1950s and 1960s traditional cake from the Moravian Church, a Protestant denomination with roots in Central Europe. The cake was made with a sweet yeast dough enriched with mashed potatoes, butter, sugar, and eggs, then pressed into a baking pan, allowed to rise, and topped with a generous layer of brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon before baking. The result was a soft, sweet, tender cake with a crunchy, caramelized topping that was irresistible. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Mashed potatoes were often left over and free, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Moravian sugar cake was served at church gatherings, holidays, and special occasions, and it was the cake that represented Moravian tradition and community. The mashed potatoes added moisture and tenderness to the dough, and the brown sugar topping caramelized during baking, creating a sweet, crunchy crust. The cake was best served warm, when the topping was still slightly gooey and the cake was fragrant and tender. Moravian sugar cake was traditionally made for Christmas and Easter, and it was the cake that connected Moravian families to their heritage and faith. The dough was soft and pillowy, the topping was sweet and buttery, and the cinnamon added warmth and spice. The cake was served in squares, often with coffee or tea, and it was the cake that everyone looked forward to at church gatherings and holiday celebrations. Moravian sugar cake disappeared from mainstream home baking when regional and ethnic cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations outside the Moravian community stopped learning the traditional recipe. The cake required patience. The dough had to rise twice, and the topping had to be applied carefully, and it couldn't be rushed. Moravian sugar cake was the cake that tasted like tradition, faith, and community, and it survived in Moravian bakeries and households where the recipe was passed down through generations. The cake was best served warm. The brown sugar and butter created a caramelized crust that was sweet, crunchy, and addictive, and the cinnamon added warmth and depth. Moravian sugar cake was the cake that represented heritage, tradition, and the power of simple ingredients turned into something extraordinary. It was the cake that modern bakers rediscovered when they wanted to taste history and connect with their root. Moravian sugar was traditional. Hummingbird cake was southern and tropical. Hummingbird cake was a 1960s and 1970s southern layer cake made with mashed bananas, crushed pineapple, chopped pecans, cinnamon, and vanilla, then frosted with cream cheese frosting. The cake was moist, dense, and packed with fruit and nuts, and it became one of the most requested cakes in Southern Living magazine. The name came from the idea that the cake was so sweet it could attract hummingbirds. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Bananas were cheap, canned pineapple was affordable, and pecans were available in bulk. Hummingbird cake was served at birthdays, church suppers, potlucks, and special occasions, and it was the cake that everyone loved. Bananas and pineapple added moisture and sweetness, the pecans added crunch and richness, and the cinnamon added warmth. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the sweet, fruity cake. Hummingbird cake was made by mixing the bananas, pineapple, pecans, and spices into a simple cake batter, then baking in layer pans until golden and springy. The layers were cooled, then stacked and frosted with cream cheese frosting. The cake was often garnished with extra chopped pecans pressed into the sides and top, and it looked impressive and elegant on a cake stand. Hummingbird cake disappeared from mainstream home baking when layer cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred simpler, faster desserts. The cake required effort, baking the layers, making the frosting, and assembling the cake, but the result was always worth it. Hummingbird cake was the cake that tasted like the South, felt like hospitality, and made everyone ask for the recipe. The cake was best served at room temperature, sliced thin to show off the layers and the cream cheese frosting. The bananas and pineapple made the cake incredibly moist, and it lasted for days when stored in the refrigerator. The pecans added texture and crunch, and the cinnamon added warmth and depth. Hummingbird cake was the cake that tasted tropical, southern, and irresistible, and it was the cake that modern bakers rediscovered when they wanted to taste a classic southern dessert. The cream cheese frosting was essential. It added tanginess and richness that balanced the sweetness of the fruit, and the cake was often decorated with fresh flowers or extra pecans. Hummingbird cake was the cake that represented Southern hospitality, tradition, and the power of simple ingredients turned into something extraordinary. Hummingbird was tropical. Italian cream cake was nutty, coconutty, and elegant. Italian cream cake was a 1960s and 1970s elegant layer cake made with buttermilk, shredded coconut, chopped pecans, butter, sugar, eggs, and vanilla, then frosted with cream cheese frosting. The cake was moist, tender, and packed with coconut and pecans, and it became one of the most requested cakes in the South. Despite the name, the cake had no Italian origins. It was a Southern creation that became a classic. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Coconut was 30 cents, pecans were affordable in bulk, and buttermilk was 25 cents. Italian cream cake was served at weddings, birthdays, holidays, and special occasions, and it was the cake that looked elegant and tasted sophisticated. The buttermilk added moisture and tanginess, the coconut added sweetness and texture, and the pecans added crunch and richness. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the sweet nutty cake. Italian cream cake was made by creaming butter and sugar, adding eggs one at a time, then alternating buttermilk and flour, and finally folding in the coconut and pecans. The batter was divided between 3-layer pans and baked until golden and springy. The layers were cooled, then stacked and frosted with cream cheese frosting. The cake was often garnished with extra chopped pecans and shredded coconut pressed into the sides and top, and it looked stunning on a cake stand. Italian cream cake disappeared from mainstream home baking when 3-layer cakes fell out of favor and younger generations preferred simpler, faster desserts. The cake required effort, baking 3 layers, making the frosting, and assembling the cake, but the result was always worth it. Italian cream cake was the cake that tasted like elegance, felt like celebration, and made everyone ask for the recipe. Italian cream was elegant, but icebox cakes were coming. No baking required. The first 50 cakes were classics, bunt cakes, holiday cakes, and Southern traditions, hummingbird and Italian cream. But the next 5 go no-bake. Chocolate wafer icebox, lemon icebox with graham crackers, strawberry icebox, pineapple refrigerator, and chocolate eclair. These were the refrigerator cakes that required no oven. Chocolate wafer icebox cake was a 1950s and 1960s no-bake cake made by layering chocolate wafer cookies with whipped cream, then refrigerating overnight until the cookies softened and the layers melded together into a cake-like texture. The result was a striped, elegant dessert that looked impressive but required no baking, no mixing, and almost no effort. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A box of chocolate wafer cookies cost around 30 cents, and heavy cream was 50 cents. Chocolate wafer icebox cake was served at summer gatherings, potlucks, and dinner parties, and it was the cake that impressed guests without requiring any baking skills. The whipped cream was sweetened with sugar and vanilla, then spread between each layer of cookies. The cake was assembled in a loaf shape or a round shape, then refrigerated for at least 6 hours or overnight until the cookies absorbed moisture from the whipped cream and softened into a tender, cake-like texture. The finished cake was sliced to reveal beautiful striped layers of chocolate and cream, and it was served cold, often with extra whipped cream or fresh berries on top. The chocolate wafers added a deep chocolate flavor, and the whipped cream was light, airy, and sweet. The contrast between the dark chocolate cookies and the white cream was striking, and the cake looked like it came from a bakery. Chocolate wafer icebox cake disappeared from home baking when chocolate wafer cookies became harder to find, and younger generations stopped learning the icebox cake technique. The cake required patience. It had to sit overnight to soften properly, and it couldn't be rushed. Chocolate wafer icebox cake was the cake that proved you didn't need an oven to make something impressive, elegant, and delicious. Chocolate wafer was elegant. Lemon icebox with graham crackers was tangy and refreshing. Lemon icebox cake was a 1950s and 1960s no-bake cake made by layering graham crackers with a lemon, filling made from sweetened condensed milk, lemon juice, lemon zest, and sometimes whipped cream or whipped topping. The layers were refrigerated overnight until the graham crackers softened and the filling set into a creamy, tangy, refreshing dessert. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A box of graham crackers cost around 25 cents. A can of sweetened condensed milk cost 30 cents. And lemons were cheap. Lemon icebox cake was served at summer gatherings, potlucks, and picnics, and it was the cake that tasted like sunshine and required no baking. The lemon filling was bright, tangy, and sweet, and the graham crackers added a subtle honey flavor and a tender, cake-like texture once softened. Lemon icebox cake was assembled by layering graham crackers in the bottom of a baking dish, spreading a layer of lemon filling on top, then repeating the layers until the dish was full. The top layer was typically graham crackers or whipped cream, and the cake was refrigerated for at least 6 hours or overnight. The graham crackers absorbed moisture from the lemon filling and softened into a tender, cake-like layer, and the result was a striped, refreshing dessert that looked impressive and tasted delicious. Lemon icebox cake disappeared from home baking when no-bake cakes fell out of favor and younger generations preferred faster, more convenient desserts. The cake required patience. It had to sit overnight to soften properly, and it couldn't be rushed. Lemon icebox cake was the cake that proved you didn't need an oven to make something impressive, refreshing, and delicious. The cake was best made a day in advance, and it was perfect for summer because it didn't heat up the kitchen. Lemon filling was tangy and sweet, and the graham crackers added a subtle honey flavor and a tender texture. Lemon icebox cake was the cake that tasted like lemon meringue pie without the meringue, and it was the dessert that everyone loved. The cake was often topped with whipped cream, lemon zest, or fresh berries, and it was served cold, straight from the refrigerator. The lemon filling had to be made with fresh lemon juice. Bottled lemon juice didn't work as well, and the graham crackers had to be layered evenly to create perfect stripes. Lemon icebox cake was the ultimate summer dessert, and it was the cake that made guests ask for the recipe. Lemon was tangy. Strawberry icebox was fruity and pink. Strawberry icebox cake was a 1950s and 1960s no-bake cake made by layering graham crackers or vanilla wafer cookies with a strawberry filling made from fresh or frozen strawberries, whipped cream, and sugar. The layers were refrigerated overnight until the cookies softened and the filling set into a creamy, fruity pink dessert that tasted like summer. Cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Fresh strawberries were cheap in season, and frozen strawberries were affordable year-round. Strawberry icebox cake was served at spring and summer gatherings, potlucks, and picnics, and it was the cake that tasted like fresh strawberries and required no baking. The strawberry filling was sweet, fruity, and creamy, and the cookies added a subtle vanilla flavor and a tender, cake-like texture once softened. Strawberry icebox cake was assembled by layering cookies in the bottom of a baking dish, spreading a layer of strawberry filling on top, then repeating the layers until the dish was full. The top layer was typically whipped cream and fresh strawberry slices, and the cake was refrigerated for at least 6 hours or overnight. Cookies absorbed moisture from the strawberry filling and softened into a tender, cake-like layer, and the result was a striped, fruity dessert that looked impressive and tasted delicious. Strawberry icebox cake disappeared from home baking when no-bake cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred faster, more convenient desserts. The cake required patience. It had to sit overnight to soften properly, and it couldn't be rushed. Strawberry icebox cake was the cake that proved you didn't need an oven to make something impressive, fruity, and delicious. The cake was best made a day in advance, and it was perfect for summer because it didn't heat up the kitchen. The strawberry filling was sweet and fruity, and the cookies added a subtle vanilla flavor and a tender texture. Strawberry icebox cake was the cake that tasted like strawberry shortcake without the baking, and it was the dessert that everyone loved. The cake was often topped with extra whipped cream, fresh strawberry slices, or a drizzle of strawberry sauce, and it was served cold, straight from the refrigerator. The strawberry filling had to be made with fresh or frozen strawberries. Canned strawberries didn't work as well, and the cookies had to be layered evenly to create perfect stripes. Strawberry icebox cake was the ultimate summer dessert, and it was the cake that made guests smile and ask for seconds. Strawberry was fruity, pineapple refrigerator. Cake was tropical and creamy. Pineapple refrigerator cake was a 1950s and 1960s no-bake cake made by layering graham crackers with a pineapple filling made from crushed pineapple, whipped cream, sugar, and sometimes cream cheese or vanilla pudding. The layers were refrigerated overnight until the graham crackers softened and the filling set into a creamy, tropical dessert that tasted like pineapple pie without the crust. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. A can of crushed pineapple cost around 25 cents, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Pineapple refrigerator cake was served at summer gatherings, potlucks, and picnics, and it was the cake that tasted tropical and required no baking. The pineapple filling was sweet, creamy, and tangy, and the graham crackers added a subtle honey flavor and a tender cake-like texture once softened. Pineapple refrigerator cake was assembled by layering graham crackers in the bottom of a baking dish, spreading a layer of pineapple filling on top, then repeating the layers until the dish was full. The top layer was typically whipped cream and a garnish of maraschino cherries or extra crushed pineapple, and the cake was refrigerated for at least 6 hours or overnight. The graham crackers absorbed moisture from the pineapple filling and softened into a tender, cake-like layer, and the result was a striped tropical dessert that looked impressive and tasted delicious. Pineapple refrigerator cake disappeared from home baking when no-bake cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred faster, more convenient desserts. The cake required patience. It had to sit overnight to soften properly, and it couldn't be rushed. Pineapple refrigerator cake was the cake that proved you didn't need an oven to make something impressive, tropical, and delicious. The cake was best made a day in advance, and it was perfect for summer because it didn't heat up the kitchen. The pineapple filling was sweet and tangy, and the graham crackers added a subtle honey flavor and a tender texture. Pineapple refrigerator cake was the cake that tasted like vacation, felt like summer, and made everyone happy. The cake was often topped with whipped cream, maraschino cherries, or extra crushed pineapple, and it was served cold, straight from the refrigerator. The pineapple filling had to be drained slightly. Too much liquid made the cake soggy, and the graham crackers had to be layered evenly. Pineapple refrigerator cake was the ultimate no-bake tropical dessert, and it was the cake that made guests ask for the recipe. Pineapple was tropical. Chocolate eclair cake was the ultimate no-bake dessert. Chocolate eclair cake was a 1960s and 1970s no-bake cake made by layering graham crackers with vanilla pudding and whipped topping, and topping the entire cake with a rich chocolate glaze. The layers were refrigerated overnight until the graham crackers softened and the pudding set, and the result was a dessert that tasted like chocolate eclairs without the pastry, baking, or effort. The cake became one of the most popular no-bake desserts of the era. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. A box of instant vanilla pudding cost around 20 cents. Graham crackers were 25 cents, whipped topping was 30 cents, and the chocolate glaze ingredients were pantry staples. Chocolate eclair cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and it was the cake that everyone loved and everyone requested the recipe for. The vanilla pudding was creamy and smooth, the graham crackers softened into a tender, cake-like texture, and the chocolate glaze was rich, glossy, and sweet. Chocolate eclair cake was assembled by layering graham crackers in the bottom of a 9613 baking dish, spreading a layer of vanilla pudding mixed with whipped topping on top, then repeating the layers until the dish was full. The top layer was graham crackers, and the entire cake was topped with a chocolate glaze made from cocoa powder, butter, powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla extract. The glaze was poured over the graham crackers while still slightly warm, so it spread evenly and created a smooth, glossy finish. The cake was refrigerated for at least 6 hours or overnight, and the graham crackers absorbed moisture from the pudding and softened into a tender, cake-like layer. The first 55 cakes were classics: bunt cakes, holiday cakes, and icebox cakes, chocolate wafer, lemon, strawberry, pineapple, and chocolate eclair. The final 5 go into truly odd territory: potato chocolate, beet red velvet, carrot with pineapple, parsnip, and zucchini. These were the vegetable cakes. Potato chocolate cake was a 1950s and 1960s secret ingredient cake made with mashed potatoes, stirred into a chocolate cake batter, along with cocoa powder, butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. The mashed potatoes added moisture, texture, and a subtle creaminess, and the cake baked up dark, dense, moist, and intensely chocolatey. Most people had no idea. The mashed potatoes added moisture, texture, and a subtle creaminess, and the cake baked up dark, dense, moist, and intensely chocolatey. Most people had no idea there were potatoes in the cake until they were told, and the reaction was always surprise, followed by curiosity. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Mashed potatoes were often leftover and free, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Potato chocolate cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and it was the cake that used up leftover mashed potatoes and turned them into something delicious. The potatoes added moisture and kept the cake tender for days, and the chocolate flavor was rich and deep. The cake was typically frosted with chocolate buttercream or fudge icing, and it was one of the most requested cakes at church suppers and potlucks. Potato chocolate cake was made by mixing mashed potatoes, cooled to room temperature, into a standard chocolate cake batter. The potatoes had to be mashed smooth with no lumps, and they had to be unseasoned, meaning no salt, butter, or milk added. The mashed potatoes replaced some of the liquid and fat in the recipe, and they added a creamy texture and extra moisture. The batter was thick and rich, and it was baked in layer pans or a sheet pan until springy and firm. The result was a cake that tasted like pure chocolate with no hint of potato, and the texture was incredibly moist and tender. Potato chocolate cake disappeared from home baking when novelty ingredient cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations found the idea of potatoes in a cake unappetizing or strange. The cake was easy to make and tasted delicious, but the ingredient list made people uncomfortable and skeptical. Potato chocolate cake was the cake that tasted better than it sounded, and those who tried it were always surprised by how good it was and how undetectable the potatoes were in the finished cake. The cake was best served at room temperature, and it lasted for days when wrapped tightly. The mashed potatoes added moisture and tenderness, and they made the cake incredibly forgiving. It was almost impossible to overbake because the potatoes kept the crumb soft and moist. Potato chocolate cake was the cake that proved vegetables could be hidden in dessert, and it was the cake that made people rethink what belonged in a cake batter. The cake was often served with a glass of cold milk, and it was the dessert that children loved without realizing they were eating potatoes. Potato was clever. Beet red velvet was shocking and colorful next. Beet red velvet cake was a 1950s and 1960s natural red velvet cake made with cooked pureed beets stirred into a chocolate cake batter to create the signature red color without using artificial food coloring. The beets added moisture, sweetness, and a deep red hue, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and mildly chocolatey. The cake was typically frosted with cream cheese frosting, just like traditional red velvet, and it was the cake that proved natural ingredients could create beautiful, vibrant colors. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Fresh beets were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Beet red velvet cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and special occasions, and most people had no idea there were beets in the cake until they were told. The beets added a subtle earthiness that complemented the cocoa powder, and the color was natural, deep, and beautiful. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the mildly sweet, chocolatey cake. Beet red velvet cake was made by cooking fresh beets until tender, then pureeing them until smooth in a blender or food processor. The beet puree was cooled to room temperature, then stirred into a standard red velvet cake batter. The beets replaced some of the liquid in the recipe, and they added moisture, color, and a subtle sweetness. The batter was a deep, natural red color, and it was baked in layer pans until springy and firm. The layers were cooled, then stacked and frosted with cream cheese frosting. The result was a cake that looked like traditional red velvet, but tasted slightly earthier and more complex. Beet red velvet cake disappeared from home baking when artificial red food coloring became widely available and cheaper than using beets. The cake required extra effort, cooking and pureeing the beets, and younger generations preferred the convenience of food coloring that came in small bottles and required no preparation. Beet red velvet cake was the cake that proved natural ingredients could create beautiful, vibrant colors, and it was the cake that tasted more complex and interesting than traditional red velvet made with food coloring. The cake was best served at room temperature, sliced thin to show off the deep red color and the white cream cheese frosting. The beets added moisture and kept the cake tender for days, and the cream cheese frosting added tanginess and richness. Beet red velvet cake was the cake that made people rethink what belonged in a cake batter, and it was the cake that proved vegetables could be hidden in dessert without compromising flavor or appearance. Carrot cake was a 1960s and 1970s beloved cake made with grated carrots, crushed pineapple, raisins, chopped walnuts or pecans, warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, and oil instead of butter. The cake was moist, dense, and packed with fruit and nuts, and it was typically frosted with cream cheese frosting. Carrot cake became one of the most popular cakes of the 1970s, and it was the vegetable cake that everyone loved and no one questioned. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Carrots were cheap, canned pineapple was affordable, and raisins and nuts were available in bulk. Carrot cake was served at birthdays, potlucks, church suppers, and special occasions, and it was the cake that made vegetables acceptable in dessert. The carrots added moisture and sweetness. The pineapple added tang and extra moisture. The raisins added chew and sweetness, and the nuts added crunch and richness. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the sweet spiced cake. Carrot cake was made by mixing grated carrots, crushed pineapple, drained slightly, raisins, and chopped nuts into a simple cake batter made with oil, sugar, eggs, flour, baking soda, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The batter was thick and packed with ingredients, and it was baked in layer pans or a sheet pan until springy and firm. The oil made the cake incredibly moist and tender, and it kept the cake fresh for days. The layers were cooled completely. Then the cream cheese frosting was essential. It added tanginess and richness that balanced the sweetness of the cake, and it was the frosting that made carrot cake unforgettable. carrot was beloved, parsnip cake was its forgotten cousin next. Parsnip cake was a 1950s and 1960s forgotten cousin of carrot cake, made with grated parsnips instead of carrots, along with warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger, butter or oil, sugar, eggs, and flour. The parsnips added moisture, sweetness, and a subtle earthiness, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and mildly spiced. The cake was typically frosted with cream cheese frosting, just like carrot cake, and it was the cake that tasted similar but slightly more complex and interesting. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1950s. Parsnips were cheap, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Parsnip cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and most people had no idea there were parsnips in the cake until they were told. The parsnips added a subtle sweetness and a creamy texture, and the spices added warmth and depth. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the mildly sweet spiced cake. Parsnip cake was made by grating parsnips finely. The texture had to be fine and consistent, not coarse, then mixing them into a standard spice cake batter. The parsnips had to be raw, not cooked, because cooking them before adding them to the batter made them too soft and mushy. The batter was thick and packed with grated parsnips, and it was baked in layer pans, a loaf pan, or a sheet pan until springy and firm, and the texture was incredibly moist and tender. Parsnip cake disappeared from home baking when carrot cake became more popular and parsnips fell out of favor as a common vegetable in home kitchens. The cake required effort, grating the parsnips and mixing the batter, and younger generations preferred the more familiar carrot cake that everyone already knew and loved. Parsnip cake was the cake that tasted better than it sounded, and those who tried it were always surprised by how good it was and how similar it was to carrot cake, but with a slightly more complex earthy flavor. The cake was best served at room temperature, sliced thin to show off the texture and the cream cheese frosting. The parsnips added moisture and kept the cake tender for days, and the spices added warmth and complexity. Parsnip cake was the forgotten vegetable cake, and it was the cake that proved parsnips could be just as delicious as carrots when used in dessert. The cake was often served with a cup of tea or coffee, and it was the dessert that made people rethink what vegetables belonged in cake and made them appreciate the versatility of root vegetables in baking. Zucchini cake was a 1960s and 1970s vegetable cake made with grated zucchini, chopped walnuts, warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, oil, sugar, eggs, and flour. The zucchini added moisture and a subtle vegetal flavor that disappeared during baking, and the cake baked up soft, tender, and mildly spiced. The cake was typically frosted with cream cheese frosting or simple butter cream, and it became a popular way to use up excess summer zucchini from backyard gardens. The cake cost under $2 to make in the 1960s. Zucchini was cheap or free from backyard gardens, walnuts were affordable in bulk, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. Zucchini cake was served at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings, and most people had no idea there was zucchini in the cake until they were told. The zucchini added moisture and kept the cake tender for days, and the walnuts added crunch and richness. The cream cheese frosting was tangy, smooth, and rich, and it paired perfectly with the mildly sweet spiced cake. Zucchini cake was made by grating zucchini finely, skin on for color and moisture, then squeezing out excess moisture with a clean kitchen towel or paper towels before mixing it into a standard spice cake batter. The zucchini had to be grated finely because coarse shreds didn't work as well and made the cake texture uneven. The excess moisture had to be squeezed out to prevent the cake from becoming soggy or taking too long to bake. The batter was thick and packed with grated zucchini and chopped walnuts, and it was baked in layer pans, a loaf pan, or a sheet pan until springy and firm. Zucchini cake disappeared from mainstream home baking when vegetable cakes fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred simpler, faster desserts that didn't require grating vegetables. The cake required effort, grating the zucchini, squeezing out the moisture, mixing the batter, and baking. But the result was always worth it. Zucchini cake was the cake that used up excess summer zucchini and turned it into something delicious. These 60 cakes weren't just recipes. They were memories baked into layers, swirled into bunt pans, and hidden in icebox refrigerators. They were the cakes grandmothers made from scratch when boxed mixes didn't exist, when butter was expensive, and when creativity meant using mashed potatoes, grated vegetables, or leftover mashed bananas to stretch ingredients and save money. They were yellow layer cakes with chocolate frosting, devil's food with fudge icing, and angel food so light it floated off the plate. They were pineapple upside-down cakes, flipped in cast-iron skillets, marble cakes swirled with chocolate, and coconut layer cakes covered in snowy white frosting. But they were also the forgotten cakes: tomato soup cakes that shocked guests, sauerkraut cakes that tasted better than they sounded, and vinegar cakes that proved you didn't need eggs to make something delicious. Which of these 60 forgotten cakes shocked you most or reminded you of your grandmother's kitchen? Subscribe to preserve the history of Betty Crocker cakes that